ruler of the earth, the lineage in which daughters and the daughters-in-law are saddened by ill treatment, that lineage is destroyed. When out of their grief these women curse these households, such households lose their charm, prosperity, and happiness. Mahabharat, Anusashan Parva, Chapter 12, verse 14. Good evening, everyone, and the panel. I am Sanskriti, a Bachelor's of Arts History Honour student at Mata Sundari College for Women, University of Delhi. I am immensely grateful to Graduate Scholar Series Talk and my mentors for giving me this opportunity to put forth my views on a topic that is usually not talked about. It is a profound privilege to stand before you today to embark on a journey through time, a journey that will delve into a topic of immense, intricate, often tumultuous, and deeply personal relationship between gender and law in India. The topic for today's talk is Tracing Gender and Law, Vedic Egalitarianism, Colonial and Post-Colonial Realities. Our exploration will span millennia from the ancient echoes of Vedic egalitarianism, a period that might surprise many of you, to the complex, multifaceted, and sometimes challenging realities of post-colonial India. This isn't merely an academic exercise. It is, at its heart, an exploration of how legal frameworks, societal norms, cultural practices, and seismic political shifts have profoundly shaped the lives, the rights, and indeed the very identity of women across different epochs. For the next 30 minutes, we will embark on a detailed chronological and thematic analysis. We will begin by examining the Rigvedic period, an era, as I mentioned, surprising to many, offers a compelling baseline of relative gender equality. We will then transition to the transformative, and I must say, very regressive impact of the colonial period. Here, we'll focus on the insidious emergence of the gender pay gap, the economic marginalization of women, the evolving legal definitions of womanhood under British rule, and the significant, often restrictive, changes in property and marital laws. Following this, we will scrutinize the post independence era, assessing how the newly formed independent India state grappled the weighty legacy of the past and endeavored to establish a more equitable legal landscape and crucially the persistent challenges that even today remains. Finally, we will bring our discussion to the present day, engaging in a very self-critical inspection of a 21st century India women through the eyes of me, a young girl. This contemporary perspective will allow us to assess the tangible impact of historical legacies and legal reforms on current realities, and to highlight the ongoing struggles and aspirations for true gender reality. We will also integrate several relevant data and reports from international bodies such as the United Nations, providing a very global context to India's journey. This presentation aims to be more than just an academic overview. It is an invitation to reflect on the past, understand the future, and envision a more just and equitable future. By tracing the evolution of gender and law, we hope to foster a deeper appreciation for the complexities involved and the continuous, unwavering efforts required to bridge the gap between legal provisions and the lived realities. Let us begin this journey of understanding and critical reflection. We'll start with the Rigvedic period, a baseline of relative equality. A journey into the historical landscape of gender and law in India commences with the Rigvedic period, which spans approximately 1500 to 600 BCE. इस टाइम पीरियड में वुमेन का रूल काफी प्रोग्रेसिव था एज वी सी इट नाउ इफ वी कंपेयर इट टू लेटर सेंचुरीज ऋग्वेद से वी गेट टू नो कि वुमेन रिचुअल्स फिलॉसफी एंड डिसीजन मेकिंग में काफी एक्टिव थे अनलाइक लेटर पीरियड्स which are marked by increasing patriarchal constraints, the Rigvedic society appears to have afforded women a very remarkable degree of equality and agency, establishing what we consider a baseline of relative egalitarianism. Evidences from the Rig Veda, the oldest sacred text of Hinduism, suggests that women were not relegated to subordinate position, but actively participated in various spheres of life. वुमेन का इन्वॉल्वमेंट उनके डोमेस्टिक रोल्स से इतना आगे एक्सटेंडेड था दे वर इन्वॉल्व इनटू मोर रिलीजियस इंटेलेक्चुअल एंड पब्लिक डोमेन्स To see that, for example, we have Gargi Vachnakavi who challenged Rishi Yajnavalkya in a debate, and Maitri ने immortality पर discussions किए थे. The Rigved frequently mentions wives participating alongside their husbands in the sacred rites, indicating their essential roles in the spiritual life of the community. The concept of dampatti, जो हस्बैंड एंड वाइफ के बीच का पार्टनरशिप दिखाता है, ये बताता है कि घर के काम और रिलीजियस ड्यूटीज का एक जॉइंट ओनरशिप और परफॉर्मेंस दोनों मिलके करते हैं. इंटेलेक्चुअल पर्सुइट्स में भी वुमेन काफी आगे थे. दे वर इंटेलेक्चुअल पर्सुइट्स वर ओपन फॉर वुमेन. ऋग्वेद में खुद ऐसे काफी हिम्स मिलते हैं जो वुमेन सीट्स ने कंपोज किए हैं, जिन्हें ऋषिकास और ब्रह्मवादिनीज कहा जाता है. Scholars have identified around 27 women out of the 400 rishis who composed some hymns of the Rig Veda Samhita out of the 10,552 mantras. Prominent examples, as already mentioned, were Gargi Vachnakavi, who challenged, and apart from that, we have Maitri, who was another philosopher who engaged in profound discussions on the nature of immortality. Other notable Rishikas were Lopamudra and Gosha, composed their own hymns, demonstrating a very profound spiritual and intellectual capabilities. This intellectual freedom was not merely theoretical, it translated into practical autonomy. Women in Rigvedic society had the freedom to choose their life partners, a practice often commonly known as Swayamvar, where a woman selected her husband from a group of suitors. ये clearly show करता है कि मैरिटल डिसीजंस में उनका पर्सनल एजेंसी काफी स्ट्रॉन्ग था, जो लेटर पीरियड से काफी अलग था, जब अरेंज मैरिजेस एक नॉर्म बन गई थी एंड वुमेन का से लिमिटेड हो गया था. विडो रीमैरिजेस वर आल्सो अलाउड, जो बताता है कि उस समय मैरिटल स्टेटस के लिए काफी ज्यादा फ्लेक्सिबल अप्रोचेस रही कंपेयर टू लेटर टाइम्स. We also get references to a widow staying at their parents' house after divorce, or unmarried women staying at her father's place, considering the fact that women had the liberty to either stay unmarried or marry the person of her own choice. Furthermore, women held a very respected position within the family and household. They were often referred to as Ardhangini or Grihini, holding authority over household affairs. ऋग्वेद में भी काफी ऐसे वर्ड्स मिलते हैं जो वुमेन के रेवरेंस के साथ पोर्ट्रे किए जाते हैं. उन्हें उमा या अदिति जैसे गॉडेस के साथ एसोसिएट करते हैं. एंड ये दोनों गॉडेस आर जनरली नोन फॉर देयर क्रिएटिविटी, नॉलेज एंड पावर का सिंबल. The philosophical concept of Ardhanarishwar, the composite form of Shiva and Parvati, embodying the equal and inseparable halves of male and female, further reflects the deep-seated recognition of gender parity in the spiritual and cosmic order, showing both women and man as equal to their counterparts. Atharva Ved, chapter 14, verse 64. Women के लिए विद्या प्राप्त करना एक आइडियल माना गया है. Quote unquote, let her be a speaker of words, skilled in knowledge. इस टाइप के phrases हमें मिलते हैं. From Rigved chapter 10 verse 85, सूर्य शुक्ता. इस हिम में सूर्य का स्वयंवर का डिस्क्रिप्शन मिलता है. ब्राइड अपने ग्रूम को चूज करती है और मैरिज सेरेमनी का एक रिचुअलिस्टिक डिस्क्रिप्शन दिखाया गया है, wherein we can see again the fact that women had the autonomy to choose their man or choose the partner of their wishes. While it is very important to avoid romanticizing the past and acknowledge that the seeds of later patriarchal structures might have been present, the overwhelming evidence points to a society where women enjoyed considerable respect, agency, and participation in public and intellectual life. This period stands as a crucial reference point, a reminder that gender inequality was not an inherent feature of Indian society, but rather a historical development that was influenced by various socio-political and economic transformations that would unfold in subsequent eras. The Rigvedic period thus serves as a powerful baseline against which we can measure the subsequent shifts in the legal and social status of women in India. Moving forward, we'll discuss the colonial period, gender pay gap, and economic marginalization. The arrival of British colonialism in India marked a profound and, as I said, I must emphasize, a disruptive turning point in the trajectory of gender relations, and the legal status of women. The colonial administration, driven by its economic imperatives and a blend of perceived civilizing missions, introduced new legal and economic systems that often and sometimes quite deliberately exacerbated existing inequalities or created new forms of marginalization for women. This section will delve into the insidious emergence and deepening of the gender pay gap and the broader economic marginalization of women during this transformative and often painful period. Before colonial rule, while traditional gender roles certainly existed, women were often integral to household protection, agriculture, and local crafts, contributing significantly to the family economy as we see it in the Rigvedic. Their labor, through though perhaps not only formally recognized, was vital. The British economic policies, however, disrupted these traditional structures. The introduction of a market economy, new land revenue systems, and the systematic decline of indigenous industries often displaced women from their traditional economic roles. खेती, घर के काम करना, crafts, इनसे women को एक तरीके से displace कर दिया गया. For instance, the tragic collapse of the handloom industry, which heavily relied on female labor, led to widespread unemployment and deinstitution among women. One of the most striking and most unjust feature of the colonial economy was the institutionalization of a significant gender pay gap. As new industries like textile mills, tea plantations, mines emerged, women were recruited into the workforce, sure, but they were consistently paid less than their male counterparts for the same or even more hard work. This wage disparity was often justified by a pervasive colonial ideology that incredibly deemed women physically weaker, less productive, and primarily responsible for domestic duties. This patronizing logic was used to rationalize lower wages, effectively devaluing women's labor in the formal economy. Consider, for example, the jute industry of Bengal. Women were often excluded from certain factory works despite their willingness to work for lower wages. And when they were employed, their work was often conveniently categorized as unskilled or light work, further justifying their mere incomes. This systematic devaluation of women's labor not only contributed to their economic marginalization, but also established deeply problematic patterns of urban migration and changing gender dynamics within families, as men became the primary and often only wage earners or the breadwinners in the formal sector. Beyond direct wage disparities, women faced broader economic marginalization through the colonial, legal, and administrative systems. Property rights, which were often already complex under various personal laws, further became constrained. The colonial emphasis on male headship and patrilineal inheritance often solidified male control over land and assets, leaving women with limited or heartbreakingly no independent economic resources. This was particularly evident in land ownership, where women's access and control were severely curtailed, making them tragically dependent on male relatives. We often get to hear things like women back then used to own gold, which was given to their daughters or daughter in law as a security money so that they could survive or be independent in their relations. In a sense, the colonial period witnessed a systematic process of economic marginalization for Indian women. The imposition of new economic structures coupled with patriarchal ideologies, discriminatory wage practices created a deeply entrenched gender pay gap, and severely limiting women's access to independent economic resources. Moving forward, the colonial period not only reshaped the economic landscape for women in India, but also had a profound and lasting impact on the legal status. The British colonial administration, in its attempt to govern a vast and diverse subcontinent, introduced a complex legal framework, often deeply ingrained Hindu, Muslims, and other community specific laws. This section will explore how the legal definition of women evolved during this period and the significant changes that occurred in property and marital laws. In the colonial legal landscape, the definition of women was intrinsically linked to their marital status and was largely defined by the doctrine of coverture. For married women, coverture meant a complete effacement of their legal individual identity. As a femme covert, a married woman had no separate legal existence from her husband. Her legal rights and obligations were merged with his. This legal non-entity status meant she could not sue or be sued, make contracts, or own property in her own name. It had to be done on her husband's name. Her legal existence was, in essence, absorbed by her husband. This stands in stark contrast to the Rigvedic period, where women often, even within marriage, maintained a distinct identity and agency. In the colonial period, unmarried women or femme sole possessed comparatively more legal rights. They could sue or be sued, write wills, serve as guardians, or act as executors of states. However, these rights were contingent upon their unmarried status and were immediately fortified upon marriage, illustrating the profound legal transformation a woman underwent upon entering matrimony in the colonial system. The legal definition of women was thus not a static concept, but often heavily contingent on her relationship to a male guardian, fundamentally limiting her autonomy and personhood. The colonial state also engaged in a series of social reforms that, while we framed as progressive, also served to define and regulate women's life. For example, the Female Infanticide Prevention Act of 1870, while aimed at curbing a truly harmful practice, also highlighted the state's increasing intervention in personal and social matters, often reinforcing a particular and sometimes narrow vision of motherhood or womanhood. This is similar to today's abortion laws in USA, wherein it is indeed illegal to get an abortion. The British Raj also regrettably used the existing caste system as a legal bias for governance. Property rights for women were a key area. While pre colonial property rights were diverse and varied across different communities, the colonial legal system often codified and standardized these laws in ways that overwhelmingly favored male inheritance. The Punjab Laws Act of 1872, for instance, laid down rules regarding succession, female special property, and other personal matters, often reflecting existing customs that once again favored male inheritance. This systematically disempowered women economically. In terms of marital laws, the British colonial government introduced legislation that had a profound impact on women's lives. The Child Marriage Restraint Act of 1929, which set the minimum age for marriage for female at 14 years, was undoubtedly a significant step towards curbing child marriage. However, the legal framework around marriage often reinforced the idea of women's dependence on men with limited rights for divorce or remarriages, particularly for Hindu women until later reforms. The colonial state's approach to personal laws was often cautious, seeking to avoid alienating religious communities, which unfortunately meant that many patriarchal practices continued to be sanctioned. In conclusion to this particular part, the colonial period was a time of significant legal transformation for women in India. While some reforms were introduced that aimed to improve women's status, the overall impact of the colonial legal system was often reinforced patriarchal structures limiting women's economic and legal autonomy and create a very standardized and often restrictive legal framework for women's life. Moving on, we'll discuss the post colonial era and we'll compare how India was, how the society for female or women were during the post independence era. India's independence in 1947 marked a truly pivotal movement. ushering in the era of self governance and crucially a profound commitment to social justice. The newly formed Indian state, recognizing the historical injustices and the urgent need for a more equitable society, embarked on the path of legal reform aimed at empowering women. The Constitution of India, adopted in 1950, stands as a foundational document in this regard, boldly enshrining the principle of gender equality and laying the groundwork for significant legislative changes. However, the journey from constitutional promises to lived realities has been complex, marked by both inspiring progress and persistent, deeply entrenched challenges. The Indian Constitution explicitly guarantees equality before the law and equal protection of the laws and prohibits discrimination on the grounds of sex. Article 14 and 15. It also empowers the state to make special provisions for women and children, a powerful tool for affirmative actions. This constitutional commitment has been the bedrock for the series of legislative measures aimed at enhancing women's legal status. While there isn't a single explicit legal definition of women in the post independence era, the legal framework has progressively recognized women as equal citizens with distinct rights and protections. Laws has been enacted to safeguard women's rights in different spheres, including family matters, criminal offenses, employment conditions, and property ownership. The legal definition of women has become complex and often a contentious issue, particularly with the global rise of transgender rights and evolving understanding of gender identity. While traditional legal frameworks often relied on the binary biological definition of sex, contemporary legal discourse grapple with incorporating broader interpretation that encompasses gender identity and expression. For example, while some national legal interpretations, such as a recent UK Supreme Court ruling on the Equality Act, have affirmed a biological definition of women, international institutions like the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, have been interpreted to include a more expansive understanding encompassing biological, anatomical, genetic, gender performance, and or gender identity. This ongoing debate reflects a fundamental shift in the colonial era's rigid, coverture-based definition to a more fluid and contested understanding of gender in law, driven by human rights, advancement, and social movements. One of the most significant areas of reform has been in the property and marital laws, which were heavily influenced by patriarchal customs and colonial codification. The Hindu Succession Act of 1956 was a landmark legislation that granted Hindu women greater rights to inherit property, including ancestral property, which was largely denied to them in the colonial era. This act was further amended in 2005, making daughters a co-partner by birth in joint family property, thereby giving them equal rights as son, a truly transformative step. Similarly, the Married Women's Property Act ensures that a married woman retains full ownership and control over her property, providing a crucial step towards financial independence and security. In marital laws, reforms have aimed to address issues such as child marriage, dowry, and divorce. The Dowry Prohibition Act of 1961 sought to curb the practice of dowry, which often led to violence and economic exploitation of women. Divorce laws have also been amended to include provisions for maintenance, alimony, and property rights for women, aiming to provide them with financial security post-divorce. However, it's also important to note that Indian laws does not automatically grant a woman a share of the husband's property acquired before marriage in divorce cases, highlighting areas where further reform is still needed. Despite these legal advancements, the gender pay gap and economic marginalization persists as significant, stubborn challenge in post-independence India. While women's participation in the workforce has increased, they continue to earn less than men for the same work. According to the World Inequality Report 2022, Men in India earn a staggering 82% of the labor income, while women share stands at a mere 18%. The Monster Salary Index 2023 further indicates that women earn 19% less than men in similar roles. This disparity is not solely due to legal barriers, as India has relatively few laws that impede women's economic participation. Instead, it is often a result of societal norms, occupational segregation, and the concentration of women in the informal sectors where wages are low and protections are very minimal. The economic marginalization is also reflected in women's representation in leadership positions across sectors, a visible sign of the work still need to be done. The Hindu Succession Act 1956, customary Hindu law, did not allow women to succeed or to property nor own property in their own name. According to Manu Dharma Shastra, women needed to depend on their fathers, husbands, and sons for their sustenance. Women did not have a birthright to their family property. Women were allowed right to maintenance, sustenance, but property did not vest in them. The Hindu code was seen as the first major reform in Hindu laws and the first time gave women a right to succeed to property, even though it did not grant full equality. Amendments to the Hindu Succession Act in 2005 secured equal shares of women even in properties. Before this amendment, only men could be the partner and men had the birthright to the property. Coming forward, we'll discuss the this act was challenged as unconstitutional, but the court held in Daniel Latifi versus Union of India that, in view of their interpretation of the Muslim Women Act 1986, the provisions of the act were not in violation of Articles 14 and 21 of the Constitution. This approach of the Supreme Court in the legislature has been criticized as denying women the right to equality and using personal laws to perpetuate discrimination against women when it is already been observed that for centuries women were denied equality to customary laws, to continue their enforcement must be held to be violative to the right of equality. The Prohibition of Child Marriage Act 2006 was passed repealing the earlier Child Marriage Restraint Act 1929 after the perceived failure of the earlier legislation on child marriages. The new act specifically prohibits child marriages and prescribes a higher penalty for person involved in child marriages and also provides for authorities responsible for the prevention of child marriages. It also makes the marriage voidable at the option of parties and also void if made in contravention of the injunction order restraining the marriage. Moving forth, we'll conclude this topic by saying the post-independence era has witnessed a concerted effort to establish gender equality through legal reforms. The Indian Constitution and subsequent legislation have provided a robust framework for women's rights in property, marriage, and other spheres. However, the persistent gender pay gap and economic marginalization underscores the complex interplay between law, society, and economy. Bridging the gap between legal provisions and lived realities remains a critical ongoing task requiring just not only further legal reforms, but also fundamental shifts in the societal attitudes and economic structures. This ongoing struggle highlights the urgent need for continuous advocacy and implementation to ensure that the constitutional promise of equality translates into tangible improvement of all lived women in India. Uh, I'll just conclude with my personal self reflection by saying, as I stand here today, having traced this entire long history of gender and law in India, from the spirit of equality in the Vedic age to a very complicated post colonial present, I feel it's important to pause for a moment and look inward. I tend to ask myself, what does this long winding journey really mean for a young girl growing up in 21st century? For me, the answer is not that simple. It is often a story of pride and frustration, of immense progress and equally stubborn obstacles. I was born in a country whose constitution tells me that I'm equal to any man. That is no small thing. My great grandmother did not have such a guarantee in her youth. Today I have laws that protects me from child marriages, from dowry demands, from domestic violences. I have the right to go to school, to choose my own career and to inherit property. Rights that women before me had to fight bitterly to achieve. But when I look around, I see women piloting aircrafts, heading companies, winning Olympic medals, and making groundbreaking scientific discoveries. I follow women leaders on social media who inspires me daily. I can post my thoughts online, learn from people across the globe, and express myself in ways my ancestors could never have imagined. In theory, the digital world gives me a platform as big as anyone else. But then reality intervenes. Because in everyday life, I still see how far I have to go. When I walk home from after sunset, I feel that I need to clutch my phone tightly, ready to call someone if I sense danger. I have watched my male classmates interrupt my female teachers without consequences, while girls are often told to be more polite or less aggressive, or to sit in a certain way. I have heard relatives casually suggest that certain careers like the armed forces, long distance trucking, or even late night journalism are not for girls. The gap between law and lived realities often stares me in the face. In my own city, I know girls who were married off at 17 despite the law against child marriages. A classmate dropped out of school because her family thought investing in her brother's education was more practical. Even now, I have friends who are told not to stay out of the house after dark for their own safety just because they're a girl. These are not isolated incidents or events. They are part of the pattern that reflects how societal attitudes often lag behind legal reforms. And I'm sure all the girls have faced this at least once. And then there's many other. Then there's money. Even if I become as qualified as my male colleague, statistics tells me that I might still be paid less. As mentioned, women earn 18% of the total labor index. That's just not a number. It's the difference between being able to live independently and having to rely on someone else for basic needs. I also cannot ignore how inequalities multiply for women in marginalized communities. A girl from marginalized community, for example, may face both caste prejudice and gender discrimination, meaning her barriers to education, safety, employment are far greater than mine. This intersection of caste and gender reminds me that fight for equality is not just about women as a whole, but also ensuring justice for all women across all locations. Day to day life reflects these tensions too. In many Indian households, even when women work full time, they are still expected to handle majority of the household chores, cooking, cleaning, caring for their children and elders. I've seen this in my own house. A mother waking up at 5 a.m. to cook breakfast for everyone, despite going to the workplace. And majorly, a man in the family in the kitchen is rarely lifts a finger. It's because it's not a man's job. These are not just family quirks, they're a reflection of how traditional gender roles persist. I see these contradictions everywhere. On paper, India is a country where I can be anything. In reality, many girls still drop out of the school to help at home, are pressured to marry young, or are told that their safety depends on how they dress or behave. I know women who hesitate to take up jobs in other cities because their families fear it's not safe for a girl to live alone. I know mothers who give up promising careers because childcare is seen as their primary duty, not the father's. And yet, I cannot ignore the change that is happening, often in small but powerful ways. To conclude, my vision is of an India where gender does not dictate opportunity, where household chores are not shared, where women can walk home at midnight without fear, where daughters inherit land without a fight, and where a girl's ambition is celebrated without conditions. So, my hope is simple but urgent that one day a girl in India will look back at this time and see it as a turning point when equality moved from the pages of constitution, moved from being written into the lived realities of every home, every street, and every workplace. Thank you.
That was really a tremendous talk, Ms. Sanskriti. We will go to Dr. Shivangi ma'am for the brief, about your talk. But before that, I just, we are running out of time, so I do not have the liberty of time to ask a lot of questions regarding your topic. But I just the question that we ask from our every speaker, that how was your experience with the Graduate Scholar Talk series? If you can brief in.
Sir, it was amazing. I had the best team, honestly. I had the support of the team throughout the time, 24/7. I could reach out to them. I could reach out to Manish, sir. Samriddhi ma'am, she helped me with the code to start. And Manvi ma'am was there throughout the time. So it was indeed a great experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So now I would like to invite Dr. Shivangi ma'am to give her brief on the topic talk in the event today. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you so much. First of all, congratulations, Sanskriti, for such a rich and insightful presentation. I mean, it's a long journey that you have traced and tried to capture that of women's legal identity in India. And to span it over such a, from the sacred verses of Rig Veda, from Athar Veda, you have quoted that, and then coming back to the point, to the constitutional guarantees of our present time, the constitutional framework. I just want to say law is very important. We are, as humans, being governed by law. These are not just set of rules. These are living frameworks which govern our relationship, how we resolve conflicts, and shape the very structure of the society. What I could understood and what you have tried to trace through your topic and presentation is that with the society changing, the nature of the laws and the structure have kept on changing, the legal framework with the need and how the society responds to it. So it's very important how these interactions have taken place between the society and the law. How are they governed? Because it reflects the values and the priority and the hierarchy of that time. That's what I thought. So in the Vedic age, like you have tried to represent a nuanced notion and try to reflect that women like Gargi and Maitri participated in philosophical debates and had certain legal rights like property ownership. And then we come to the later Vedic period of the concept of Istri Dhan, which is still very relevant, that we still use. जो हमें शादी के बाद हमें ज्वेलरी है वो मिलती है, that's still quoted and notion as the Stri Dhan, which is very much relevant. However, these rights have embedded within the patriarchal framework. And over the times, we have seen a codification through Dharma Shastras and how these social customs have formed. So there's always been a codification over that period of time. The nature has been changing. And today we have, like the constitution, we have the rights being traced into that. And then we have the colonial area bringing in its own contradictions. How British introduced codified legal system, positioning them as being that we are reformist, often being selective and driven by the administrative convenience and through a colonial gaze, using what I feel instruments like census report to trace all these things. Like age of consent act, that is very important. Age of consent report, on which the basis you said that 14 years was made the child marriage restraint act, that was based on that only, on the age of consent report of 1890 1928 and 29. So how these data has framed, these case studies have framed the colonial age acts, what we have seen. Eventually coming to the post-colonial scenario, I would not take too much of time. I know there's a constraint of time, but very interestingly, how you have come from the Vedic age to the colonial and then to the post-colonial age, stating many of the data and the facts. Especially, I was reading a few days back, there was a global gender report, gap report, and still at today's point of view, we have 123 years of that parity gap to be filled up. 123 years in 2025 also वर्ल्ड इकोनॉमिक फोरम की रिपोर्ट के हिसाब से अगर हम ग्लोबल जेंडर gap report की हम बात करें, we have still not reached that parity and still it's going to take 123 years. And this is unanimously and region wise different data hai. So not going into that, but still we have come a long way, still a long way to go. That's what I feel. So post-colonial scenario, there's a decisive legal shift that we are seeing where landmark reforms like Hindu Code Bill, Dowry Prohibition Act, even POSCO, we have many of the laws on domestic violence, we have on divorces and workplace harassment. That is also very important. That has aimed to break away from the centuries of the gender inequity, not inequality, but inequity. And lastly, not going long way, but congratulating you once again. And want to end with, while you were presenting and you were talking about this, I was remembering Mary Wollstonecraft. Unki काम और उनका book, I was the influential work, A Vindication of the Rights of the Women, which is a very important stepping stone into this. And with her quote, I would like to end and say, she quote and she said, I do not wish them means women, to have power over men, but power over themselves. So it's not a battle of equality of having a power over somebody, but it's more of on the basis of having it over on ourselves and having that kind of an authority and independence. And yes, Sanskriti, you are one of the example of how we have come a long way, and you have this platform, and we are hearing to you. And thank you so much. Thank you, Manish sir, and thank you GSTS for such a platform and wonderful presentation.